Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm very pleased to welcome you to ASPI's webinar on the complexities around the foreign fighter or foreign volunteer issue in the Russia-Ukraine war. My name is Katja Theodorakis. I head the Counterterrorism Policy Center at ASPI, and I'm delighted that I'm joined today by three formidable experts who will share their expertise with us. I'm joined by Professor Ben Saul, who's the Challis Chair of International Law at the University of Sydney and an Associate Fellow of Chatham House in London. We have Dr Sara Meger, who's a lecturer in international relations at the University of Melbourne and who focuses on international security and gender in international relations. And then we have Munira Mustaffa, who just recently founded Chasseur Group and serves as its executive director. She's also a non-resident fellow at the New Lines Institute, where she does analysis on all sorts of security topics. So welcome. Thank you for joining us on the panel today. Now, I will keep my introduction very brief. And of course, a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us online. Sorry, I was saying to panelists before that, it's quite challenging to not have people in a room still. And even though we've all gotten used to doing things online, I still struggle. So I'm very welcome to everyone joining us. I know it's a busy time, especially in Australia with an election coming up, and also overseas for anyone who's joining us and sort of from a different time zone. And thank you, Munira, who's joining us from Malaysia, to make time for this. So we'll get right into this. There's obviously been a lot of discussion about the foreign fighter issue before even the conflict or the war started and Russia invaded. And that's because Ukraine have been an epicenter of what the Sufan Center called an epicenter for right-wing extremism and people flocking there for all sorts of ideological reasons. And the interesting thing being that when Vladimir Putin justified his invasion, of saying he was denazifying Russia, he was denazifying Ukraine, he was bringing it back into the homeland, sort of the lost sheep back into the fold. And there are accusations of extremism on both sides. And I think that's only one of the complexities to sort of unpack what's going on with, are there real Nazis fighting there? Where are they coming from? What is the status of the Azov battalion? That's where most of the accusations are leveled against, saying, they're just neo-Nazis and this foreign legion that has been instituted by the Ukrainian president. Are we talking about foreign fighters here, even according to definitions, when someone is actually joining a state actor? Because the definition of foreign fighters usually revolves around non-state actors who join a conflict, but not actually fighting for an integrated army. So there are all these interesting definitional complexities and questions that we're hoping to tackle, also look at the different groups that are active there and how certain state actors might be mobilizing them, some of the issues between combatant status, when is someone a legal combatant, how can other actors manipulate this or just ignore this, how much does the legislation that is in place in international law or also in domestic legislation in various countries, how much room does it give us? And, I'm sure we're getting lots of interesting questions from the audience also in terms of how this mobilization and the response to it by governments, especially the Australian one, compares to previous situations, especially, of course, the Syrian war. Because we have to keep in mind that when we talk about foreign fighters in the public discourse, but also in our policy responses, that it's synonymous with jihadis. And in the UN definition, they add that element of terrorism in there. So we haven't really had a situation where we now have to look at this differently, because the cause for which fighters might be mobilizing or volunteers might be mobilizing all of a sudden is seen as a just cause, which adds complexities, moral ones as well. Like, is there hypocrisy? Do we have double standards? And so those are some of the things we will be looking at. And I will not talk any longer, but give the floor to our experts who will, each one will speak for up to 5 minutes and sort of a brief statement and highlight some of the things that stand out to them, some interesting questions or angles. And then we'll open it up to a free discussion amongst us with audience questions. So I look forward to everyone's contributions. So we'll start with you, Ben.
Thanks, Katja, and thanks for inviting me, and welcome everybody. Look, I just want to give you a really brief overview of the international law and Australian domestic law context affecting these foreign fighters. Firstly, under international law, I'd say international law does not prohibit foreigners from joining the national armed forces of a foreign country. There are Security Council resolutions which ban foreigners travelling to participate in terrorist acts in another country, but that generally wouldn't be considered to include participating in combat in state militaries in compliance with the law of war. There is a Mercenaries convention under international law. Australia is not a party to that, but that really wouldn't cover most of the so-called foreign fighters joining Ukraine at the moment, mainly because to be a mercenary, you can't be a member of the foreign state's armed forces. So precisely because Ukraine is essentially integrating foreign volunteers into its armed forces, immediately they're not mercenaries. They're also not mercenaries probably because they're just not getting paid substantially more than Ukrainian soldiers, which is another part of the mercenaries definition. So under international law, really there's no problem there. And of course, Australia itself, if you look on the Australian Army website, there's a whole page devoted to calling on foreigners to come and join the Australian Armed Forces. Likewise, many Australians have gone to join with and even fought with militaries like in the UK, the US, Israel, the French Foreign Legion. I mean, there are lots of past examples. In terms of the domestic law framework, really there are three key points to make. Since 1978, Australia has had what we call foreign incursions or recruitment offences, and they essentially make it a crime for any Australian citizen or resident to go to another country to engage in hostilities. The thing, though, is there's an exception for fighting for government armed forces. So it really only prohibits joining rebel groups, insurgents, terrorists, etc., who are fighting against a government, not for a government. The reason for that, and this is the reason given in the development of the legislation, a couple of reasons. One is Australians could be dual nationals, so Australia shouldn't be criminalising the entitlement of a dual national to fight for their other country of nationality, and we also shouldn't be interfering in the sovereignty of that foreign state to decide who can fight in its armed forces. There was also a kind of individual liberty argument, which is that why should Australian law prohibit Australians from pursuing a career in the British Army or the American Marines? Also, and this is at the pointier end of things, why should Australia prohibit Australians going off to defend the Spanish Republic, a government, from fascist forces trying to overthrow it in the Spanish Civil War? So these were some of the historical considerations. Of course, if Australians do fight abroad with a foreign army and commit war crimes, the law of war already makes that prohibited and criminal. And so there's ample legal authority, including under Australian law, to prosecute those kinds of killings of civilians or other violations of the law of war. What I would say, though, is that Australia does also separately have a power to impose sanctions, including military sanctions, on any foreign government. So if we don't want Australians fighting in the Russian armed forces or the Syrian armed forces, we already have sanctions on those countries, which would prevent service in particular foreign militaries if the government decides to do that. The final consideration I'd mention is, of course, there are also Australian terrorism offences. And essentially, if you think about that, our definition of terrorism makes it a crime to essentially commit any act of violence against any foreign government anywhere in the world in order to coerce or intimidate that government for a political reason, amongst others. And if you think about how that might apply to, let's say, Australians fighting for Ukraine against Russia, I mean, the use of military violence by a state against another state in a war is archetypally violence for a political reason, designed to compel that other government to stop, in this case, invading Ukraine. The problem with the Australian terrorism legislation, and this has been pointed out many times, but the Australian Parliament has never addressed it, is that it contains no exception for participation in armed conflict in armed forces governed by international humanitarian law. So whereas the law of war says if you fight as a combatant and you comply with the law of war, you have immunity from domestic criminal prosecution in every country. In contrast, Australian law says you're a terrorist even if you fight for the Ukraine military against Russia to repel Russia's aggressive, illegal invasion. That's a serious problem. I mean, Australia previously has said, look, prosecutors will just exercise their good sense not to prosecute. Well, that's not an answer, right? Because it's the job of the Parliament, and the British Supreme Court has said this, it's the job of the Parliament under our doctrine of separation of powers to clearly define who is criminally liable. It's not the job for a member of the executive government, i.e. the police and the prosecutors, to make it up on the fly who is a terrorist in a particular case. So because we sympathise with Ukraine, we won't prosecute you as a terrorist, even though the law says you're a terrorist. I mean, that kind of exception should be in the law, not kicked down to prosecutors to make political decisions in individual cases. The only other laws that I'd mention to conclude, of course, if you're fighting for a foreign government's armed forces against Australia, a separate criminal offence applies. That's treason under federal law. So already there's enough legal authority to deal with you. There is also, coming out of the Islamic State response in Syria, some new offences of entering an area declared to be off limits by the minister. Of course, that's not applicable here for two reasons. One is no terrorist organisation has been declared in Ukraine, which is a precondition for declaring an area off limits, like we did in Raqqa and Mosul back in Iraq and Syria. And secondly, even if an area is declared, the offences do not apply, again, to members of state armed forces. So it wouldn't preclude you from joining the Ukrainian military. Now, of course, there are lots of pros and cons of the various legal measures and offences I've described. And actually, I think the foreign recruitment offences are both too narrow and too broad in different ways. And perhaps we can touch on that some more in questions. Thanks, and back to you, Katja.
Excellent. Thank you so much. There's so much there, and it's a really good overview to start with. We'll go to Dr. Sara Meger next. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Katja. Thanks for having me. So I'll just give a bit of an overview of some of the research I've done. I'm a lecturer in international relations and interested in the causes of war, conflict, and political violence. And so I've been researching the conflict in Ukraine since 2017, and during fieldwork there was quite surprised to come across a number of Western foreign fighters at the time. And in the course of a series of interviews, at the time, I mean, they weren't a primary category of respondents that I was looking for, but in the course of the interviews that I was conducting with combatants in the conflict, came across about 15 to 20 foreigners, and was interested in some of the sort of emerging patterns of who was going at that time to fight, and how there were some certain push and pull factors that seemed common amongst the foreigners that had been to Ukraine between 2014, when the war in Donbass broke out, and 2019, which was the end date of that data collection. From that research, it was interesting to me how almost all of the foreigners all bar one had prior military service experience. And this seemed to me to challenge some of the prevailing narratives in international relations scholarship at the time anyway, about what is the motivations, or who are the people going to fight in foreign conflicts. We had developed this sort of assumption that young men were being radicalized online and going to fight. I mean, a lot of this literature was premised on going to Iraq and Syria to fight for ISIS. So there was the assumption that young men are being radicalized online and going to fight, not really knowing what they're getting themselves into. But in Ukraine, almost all of the respondents I spoke with had prior military service and combat experience in Afghanistan or Iraq. And so it seemed to me interesting to think through, what is it about the demobilization and reintegration of our own Western soldiers that is incomplete or insufficient, leading them to want to seek out further combat experience or get emotively attached to a foreign conflict? And the other thing that struck me from my research was how this particular conflict in Ukraine was being talked about in online spaces in a way that garnered more emotional response from Westerners than other conflicts that were ongoing. So some of my respondents talked about how this was essentially a front of a global war they saw on an ideological basis. There were foreign fighters I spoke with who went to fight for Ukraine. A lot of them joined at the time volunteer battalions. One of the most popular for foreigners was a battalion that still exists called Pravi Sector or Right Sector, which is a very openly neo-Nazi organization that refused to be integrated into the Ukraine Armed Forces. And I think this presents a challenge for that sort of legal definition that Professor Saul was raising. Or the Georgian Legion was another area for recruiting foreigners on the pro-Ukraine side. So most of the foreigners I spoke with on that side had this ideology of nationalism and defense against communism, or this like global leftist ideology that they saw Ukraine being on the front line of, and Russia being sort of a proponent of this new threat of communism that they wanted to fight against. One of the respondents I spoke with put it quite succinctly, because I asked everyone, who is the enemy that you're fighting? And he surprisingly said, communists, homosexuals, and pedophiles. On the other side, though, I also spoke with foreign fighters going to fight for the separatists. And what was interesting to me was the deep ideological division. On that side, it was much more likely to see people talking about US imperialism and NATO expansionism as part of this US imperialistic agenda, and also the military-industrial complex is feeding into these forever wars. And so they saw fighting for the People's Republics as a means of sort of defending these nascent communist states from US imperial hegemony. What I think will be interesting with the new wave of foreign fighters is a few aspects. The fact that now it's very formally sanctioned by the Ukraine state, whereas previously it was a more de facto and ad hoc. The much larger influx of fighters, and the way in which on the separatist side they've been essentially mowed over by Russian forces. I have been in contact with some foreigners still on the separatist side, and they're still very much espousing the same ideology and seeing Russia's actions through that lens of fighting Nazism and US imperialism. But it raises to me interesting questions about whether we have a nuanced enough perspective on what people understand this war to be about in order to actually address the underlying issues and what's causing people to support on both sides. So I guess that's a provocation I'll throw back to discussion. Thanks.
Yes, That's exactly what we need. Thank you, because we can't, the complexities are great. So we need to have provocative questions, because I think that crowded battlefield and the narratives around it from all actors, I think they are provocative enough in themselves that we need to actually, we're obliged to ask those questions. So thank you, and especially sharing insights from having been there and having that firsthand, sort of more firsthand ethnographic experience, I think is really helpful to get that nuanced picture. So thank you. And over to you, Munira.
Thank you, Katja, for having me. Our conversation today centers on a big topic with a multitude of layers to talk about. So it makes sense that the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky would welcome foreign fighters to support the Ukrainian defenders in terms of strength. Russia has spent years incorporating the Kadyrov Seas as well as the Wagner Group into their military campaigns to help them incapacitate their opponents. And now we know that Chechen strongman Ramzan Kadyrov has worked hard to build their violent image for media reasons. And then we hear about the pro-Ukraine Chechen Sheriff Mazur battalion who are now in the fray to take Kadyrov down. The influence of foreign fighters, foreign volunteers may have on Ukraine's defense may be debatable, but the announcement and establishment of the Foreign Legion for Ukraine is a clear information win, and it shows the breadth of global support for Ukraine. Now, the primary concern with developing a foreign legionnaire is that it may entice unsavory candidates who may not subscribe to the Geneva Conventions. So on this battlefield, we have multiple actors with varying levels of combat experience and differing reasons, as well as mental health issues and resilience, which may affect their ability to withstand battlefield shocks. Now, the next point I want to bring up is the comparison of the phenomena of Islamic State foreign terrorist fighters with the whole foreign fighters rhetoric. This is reasonable given that the present threat environment and ISIS is the most recent example that we use as a point of reference. However, I believe that we should not, if we do not proceed with caution in assessing the effects of foreign fighters' mobilization in Ukraine, we risk overstating the threat, which is counterproductive in the policy response. And this is owing to the complexities of both battlefields. And we must not forget that the terrains and composition of both battlefields are radically different from one another. It's also worth noting that the management structure and conditions vary from ISIS. And I'm saying different in the context of instrumentalizing violence, because accomplishing military goals and political objectives may imply quite different things in terms of how violence is instrumentalized and organized, and the consequences can be costly anyways in terms of efficiency and control for them. So this brings me to the third point, which is the motivation and ideology that mobilize foreign fighters. So much has been talked about what motivates foreign fighters to go to Ukraine. And there have even been rumors that ISIS members may attempt to take advantage of the conflict's disarray. Again, I want to emphasize the importance of exercising caution in our analysis to avoid making biased projections of Ukraine. The ideologies does not make Ukraine the caliphate of Eastern Europe. Now there may be a common desire to fight, but their cohesiveness does not match of the militant Islamists, and that would require a completely different conversation altogether. Although I'm aware that there are some jihadists who are now trying to use or rather exploit the Ukrainian battlefield as a training ground, I believe we should not overstate the threat, given that those who call for this particular action have little influence over the others. And furthermore, I believe that there are two types of people who are joining the fight. Those who join the groups that fight alongside the Ukrainian defenders, and the white nationalists who join groups like the Azov Battalion. The second group is the one that may pose a potential security risk similar to ISIS, because their brand is all about promoting supremacist presence. For example, Ukraine's controversial Azov Battalion has received negative publicity as a result of their unapologetic links with the far-right movement, which the Kremlin has gleefully exploited as their casus belli and framed the invasion as a denazification effort. So one thing is certain, if Ukraine's foreign legionnaires misbehave while Zelensky is at the peak of his popularity as Ukraine's fearless and resilient wartime president, it's going to provide Russia with stronger propaganda value to discredit Zelensky's reputation while providing them with plausible deniability. So now the current foreign fighter mobilization has implications for future battles, particularly in the Middle East. My concern is the whataboutism that worries me as other nations struggle to contextualize reasons for banning non-state actors like Islamist militants from engaging future battles on a moral basis. So as a result of the Ukraine crisis, now it appears to the rest of the world that Westerners appear to be more inclined to fight for kin, aka white nationalists, or a cause, aka democracy, which may complicate counterterrorism efforts, particularly in reducing and managing the flow of foreign terrorist fighters and what this could mean in terms of legal implications. Also, I'm seeing some recommendations to address this problem by designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, which I think can be very problematic because, for one thing, there is no UN mandate to sanction Russia. So there's not going to be a uniform response from other nations to Russia. And this is going to make it more difficult to negotiate diplomatic channels and economic functions. So that's all I have to share for today.
Thank you so much. There's so much there. I felt like I wasn't really, it's hard to catch up with all the points, but thankfully we have lots of good questions from the audience. So I may just ask one sort of quick question to Professor Saul in terms of just the legislation as a bit of a basis for some of the questions that have come up. So what I took from your excellent summary of that was that there is legislation in place. It is not an unregulated space, but at the same time, there are some gray areas. I felt like you were hinting at that. Yes, if there are atrocities committed that violate the laws of armed conflict, there would be prosecution. But in reality, is the legislation enough? Or do we have to worry that, for example, despite best intentions, that this foreign legion, that there won't be enough oversight and that it will get so muddled and crowded on that battlefield that you cannot distinguish anymore? And also issues of if, let's say, someone gets taken captive by Russia who does not acknowledge them as combatants, and more atrocities are committed, which would, just add to the list of war crimes. Is it so messy legally, even though there are things in place, that it's just generally a bad idea for anyone to go because we just do not have adequate frameworks, and we cannot have them to contain the situation? Or would you say that things are working fairly reasonably or anywhere in between?
Yeah, thanks, Katja. Certainly, Ukraine, of course, bears primary responsibility to ensure all of its soldiers comply with the law of armed conflict, to discipline them, to prosecute them, whether they're Ukrainians or foreigners, if they commit war crimes. Of course, we know, and we know this from Australia's own experience, even extremely well-trained, well-resourced militaries do not always maintain that kind of discipline over their forces. So that's always a risk. You mentioned the Russian side. There, of course, Russia is bound to respect international humanitarian law. And if foreigners are members of Ukraine's armed forces, then upon capture, they must be given prisoner of war status, treated humanely, and they can only be prosecuted if they've committed war crimes, not if they've committed some violation of Russian law, for example. But your question does raise a really good question about whether the Australian legal settings are good enough. I don't have a concluded view on this, but certainly, it's a perfectly plausible argument to say Australians should not fight overseas, full stop, maybe unless they're a dual national of the foreign country. But if you're a sole Australian national, why should you be fighting with any foreign state's military? Now, I gave some of the reasons why that's been permitted and is still permitted up to now. So there are pros and cons on either side. I mean, there are other ways you can do it. I mentioned we've already got sanctions, but of course, sanctions are used pretty sparingly. So most of the time, even when governments are committing really serious violations of the law of war or of human rights law, we don't place military sanctions preventing foreign military service with those militaries. So a different way to do it then would be to, somehow place legal criteria in the legislation which make it automatically prohibited, i.e. without sanctions having to be declared by the minister, make it automatically prohibited to serve with any foreign military forces, government military forces, if, for example, they are systematically violating the law of war or human rights law. We do that already in a different context. So under the Arms Trade Treaty of 2013, which Australia is a party to, Australia already prohibits the export of weapons to any country if those weapons would be used to violate the international law of war, as well as Security Council embargoes, human rights law, etc. So we use that kind of approach in different contexts as well. Just finally, on the other side, of course, and this pertains to different situations, but of course there are arguments that the current law goes too far in banning all service with rebel groups in foreign countries. I mean, essentially, we say that if you want to serve in Hitler's armed forces before the war broke out in 1939, that's fine. If you want to serve with some German rebel group trying to overthrow Nazism, that's a crime under Australian law. And the only exception in the current legislation is if the minister declares that it's okay to fight with a designated rebel group. But in practice, that never happens, even for example, the Democratic Kurdish forces fighting against Islamic State, our allies fighting against the Islamic State and also the Assad government. I mean, why should Australian law criminalise rebellion to try to protect human rights and democracy against authoritarian governments? And why does Australian law allow Australians to serve in authoritarian governments, militaries?
That was very, very poignantly put at the end, and it leads really nicely into one of the questions that we got. So it is directed to you, and it hints at those blurred lines that just came up. And I think it'd also be interesting to hear from the panel on this afterwards. But so the question is from Peter. Zelensky has asked all men over 18 to stay and fight. Does this complicate and blur the difference between killing civilians and members of the Ukrainian army? And I think, sort of just adding to that, I think what's interesting with the points you've raised in this question is, it points to a dilemma to me that, do we actually know sufficiently and with sufficient certainty what goes on to make those judgment calls that would lead to, no one wants to declare certain rebel activity for freedom struggles as illegal, but the question is whether we need to get our citizens involved in that. And some of those blurred lines here, I think that's not only in terms of people getting prosecuted or more atrocities being committed and the conflict overall getting violent, but also in terms of geopolitically, is it actually in our interest to even have this low level involvement at a citizen level? Because do we actually know what's going on? Do we know, sufficiently whether a group purports everything it says it is, or there might be developments happening? So in that context, I think that question is very, very interesting.
Yeah, look, on Peter's question, Russia can only target and kill members of Ukraine's armed forces. It's true that under martial law, Ukraine's government has prohibited men aged 18 to 60 from leaving the country. That's about 6 million people. But in the Ukraine armed forces itself, there's only a couple of 100,000 people presently under arms. So until any of those men actually become part of the armed forces, they cannot be targeted. They are civilians. It also goes, though, on a policy point, to something Munira said, which is that, a lot of the value of this foreign fighter thing is propagandistic from Ukraine's perspective. I mean, if you've got 6 million Ukrainian men of fighting age, not allowed to leave the country, ready to be inducted into your armed forces at any moment, I mean, a few thousand or a few tens of thousands of foreign fighters are really not going to help you very much. Also because some of them are just there for the adventure. They're likely to cut and run whenever they like. They're not Ukrainians there to defend their homeland forever, for as long as it takes. And as others have pointed out, they're also a mixed bag. I mean, they're not necessarily there to help Ukraine. They're there for potentially other purposes as well. So I would also query that value of foreign fighters from a purely military standpoint, unless they have very specialized pre-existing military skills, which could add something to the Ukrainian army.
Sarah or Munira, would you like to add anything to any of those points raised?
I think it brings on the whole point of social media's effects on this battlefield as well, because as Professor Saul said, a lot of it has to do with information warfare to generate to project the image of strength behind each side. And my concern is that a lot of it has to do with how it is perceived for the rest of the world outside the Western lands as well, because it concerns about the legitimacy of the battle. And obviously, there's a strong support for Russia's presence in Ukraine as well, and there's a strong belief that Russia has every right to defend its borders, and they are in Ukraine for legitimate reasons. And this is something that we have to be aware of and be cautious in addressing as well, because at the end, regardless of what the legal aspects, the legal structures say about concerning the whole foreign fighters' mercenary presence in the battlefield, when it comes to the prosecution part, it's going to raise a lot of debate, intense debate about the legitimacy of the of the fight as well, and there's going to be a lot of strong arguments being made about why are the Ukrainians being supported, and why should they have the right to defend themselves, and why can't Russia do this? And I've been seeing this discussion being bounced back and forth on social media, and there's a lot of strong comparisons to the ISIS as well. So this is something that we have to take account, especially in translating them towards the legal framework.
That is such an interesting point. Sarah, did you have anything related to this or to any other topics just raised before?
Yeah, I would just add that in terms of the adding value to the Ukrainian armed forces, I mean, Ukraine's always had conscription. All men of military age would have had military training and be able to be called up quite quickly. But we have seen, given that most of the foreign fighters, even in this wave, seem to have previous military experience, there does seem to be some logistical value that they're already adding. So I saw from one Ukrainian military source that enough Canadians have volunteered that they have their own battalion of over 500 members. So the organizational structure is also going to be quite interesting, how much they're operating under the command and control structure of the Ukrainian armed forces. And the other thing I wanted to add on that note of the command and control structure is that Ukraine also has a long history in the context of the Donbass War of using more informal defense units, right? They had the volunteer battalions from 2014 to 2017. And now they've got these territorial defense units that are also operating in defense of regions of the Ukraine that are not formally armed forces. I don't know yet whether the mostly men, it seems, going to fight from foreign countries in Ukraine now are solely following that route into the formal armed forces. But I did see amongst some discussions on a Signal chat that many were looking for ways to circumvent that formal avenue, because Zelensky has said that you can come and fight, but you need to have previous military experience in your home country, and you need to sign a contract for 2 years minimum. But a lot of these men don't have an intention of staying for 2 years, and perhaps don't want to be under the auspices of the armed forces. So I know that Georgian Legion has been offering an alternative route and saying you don't need any prior military experience. We will train you ourselves. And there's also those territorial defense units that may be avenues for volunteering.
Yeah, that is so interesting. Because I had also been following, the rumors, as speaking to your point, Munira, about the propaganda value of this, and what you said, Sarah, about that this has already been a front sort of between, these really sort of Nietzschean opposing positions between imperialism and anti-imperialism, almost sort of Cold War blocks, and that gets perpetuated. And so I had seen on debates around, some US former with military experience who had joined. They were in a training ground, and I think they were being trained by Georgians, and there was a video of someone saying our passports have been taken away, we won't be able to leave, and we haven't been given anything. And then people coming back and debunking it from also from within that battlefield. But then what was more interesting, and this confirms this, Munira, is that the debates behind it, like for those people that were actually there, this was an issue about the situation on the ground, a very grave one that would affect their safety and their well-being or not for the next number of years. But then it was very ideologically hardened by the time the debate on Twitter and Signal and wherever else it was. And, it was sort of your tankies versus your anti-fascists and anti-imperialists. And that's sort of the interesting thing, that it takes on a dynamic that goes well beyond the actual geopolitical conflict, which speaks to, I think, today's conflict landscape. I'm just going to, and so we had a question here too that was sort of asking about those gray areas, and are there actual reports of with this sort of melange of groups and that with blurred boundaries, and are there any reports, and possibly criminal groups, and there's a lot of illegal activity, possibly with illegal weapons. Are there any reports of coercion that deadlocked civilians would be coerced to join groups, or what would happen, for example, if you're going over there as a foreign volunteer and things don't work out? As you mentioned, you think you might go to a different group, and all of a sudden you find yourself sort of in the grips of a criminal group or criminal activity without your and giving any consent to that. Have we heard anything there, or Munira, from your research?
No, but I would assume just because it's absent doesn't mean that it's not there.
Yeah.
Because I would still consider this as the early days. There's still a lot of fog of war to go through. There's a lot of mixed reports that's been previously wrongly reported, and turns out to be a different story altogether. And I think we should be cautious to assume that nothing is going on, and we should just assume that there's going to be a strong probability that it is already happening.
Yeah.
That's the most sensible way of going about it. And also, on top of that, I think we should also be observant of the management of violence as well, considering that the battlefield is such a mixed bag that of both sides. Because although it has the appearances of conventional warfare, but given that the various mixability of actors on the ground, there's going to be a lot of divergence on how the violence is going to be exacted on the opponents as well, and how the attacks is going to be organized. So there's something to be concerned as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll come back to this a bit more with a question we have for Professor Saul after, but I want to direct one more question to Sarah. It sort of ties into what you said before about those ideological drivers, which we often assume that it's either or, that people are either they're doctrinally, ideologically driven or religiously driven. And it's really quite interesting in that context that the Europol definition of a foreign fighter says they have to be religiously motivated to classify. They were working with this definition. I read this somewhere, and so because it was assumed in a certain type of conflict where it could only be imagined that it had to be that it had to be that kind of driving force. And so the question is, it comes from Thomas Holler, for Western foreign fighters in Ukraine, how much of a factor was individual circumstance in their choice to fight. I'm referring to situations such as divorce, job loss, that may have led these people to find personal meaning in a foreign conflict, which, as you probably know, would be, you know, in the literature on radicalization, would be your cognitive opening, and in your staircase model, something drastic has to happen for you to consider something so radical, whereas, you know, that's a contested view because it sort of dismisses ideological fervor. It sort of says, no, actually you need to be traumatized in some way to seek out something equally traumatizing. So, but yeah, any insights you have would be really, really fascinating on that.
I think it's impossible to generalize for all foreign fighters, but it does, I think, as you say, that literature does downplay the extent to which ideology is a massive motivating factor, right? We've got globally this political polarization happening, and it's reinforced as we've been talking about, by like these social media narratives that are making it so that there's only one right way that we're allowed to think and talk about these conflicts. And any challenge that we might have to these very simplistic narratives end up painting you as, you know, the other side or a saboteur. And so I think what really motivated a lot of these men in that, what I would call, I guess now, the first wave of foreign fighting to Ukraine, was more so getting trapped into these echo chambers of how to think about this conflict and finding, yes, some personal meaning in it through the lens of how they understand their social political position in their home countries and what this conflict then represents for the global forces enacting on them domestically. But I also think on a personal level, what binds all of these men together is this sense through which militarizing can reaffirm their own sense of masculine identity. So whether it's that they're attracted to these right-wing ideologies through that understanding of like the feminization of men in their home countries, the loss of opportunities for men, or how feminism has been some great challenge to the social structures of their home states, what they share is this idea that they can pick up a gun and fight in a conflict, and that somehow is a valuable and like masculine thing to do. Whereas I think for a lot of other people that may share the same ideological belief, there isn't necessarily that personal attachment to, I can do something about it. So I saw in this signal group of this second wave of foreign fighters, a lot of men talking about how, they feel compelled. It wasn't that they have some cognitive opening or trauma or some event that has spurred them on, but they see this happening and they feel personally like, I have it within my means to do something about this.
Yeah, oh, sorry, interrupted you.
I was just going to say, I think there's a lot of, what would be the word for it? They're not really rational in thinking
it's
this
not
way.
Doctrinal persuasion, maybe. I find that really fascinating, and that's also sort of the title, the talk, that humanitarian impulse. And I think we have seen that even in people who've joined ISIS. Some of the British schoolgirls, one of the sisters said, when she was asked in an interview, I think it was may have been Shamama Begum's sister, not 100% sure, which said, so how did you realize your sister was radicalized? What was going on? What were the changes? She went from watching the Kardashians to always just wanting to see the news. And she was just, really absorbed by those horrible atrocities against Syrian citizens and Muslims, and the world was just standing by. And I think that's not uncommon. I would say that's a really, actually a common feature. And we often dismiss it, saying it can't be. But the violence is actually motivated by that. That's sort of the tricky thing. That masculinity angle is really interesting. There's been a whole debate, a separate debate, the Syrian situation about what do we do about women who join. They might be just classified as travelers, but they have not picked up a gun. But, I think that, Ben, as you mentioned, that area designation, and, that has taken care of the legal aspects of this. But do you have, from your various angles, do you have anything to add to sort of a gender angle? I've only seen pictures so far of female soldiers in the Ukrainian military. That's sort of been glorified, and similar to how the Kurdish female fighters were sort of in Western media became a bit of an icon. But I haven't seen anything else yet. Has anyone picked anything up, or are there any sort of aspects, Ben, that you could add from a legal aspect? What do we do if a woman goes over to support this cause ideologically, and she says she's driving an ambulance or she's cooking meal for fighters? Do we need to watch out for this? So maybe we've got 10 minutes left. So maybe I have one more question that's directed to you as well, Ben. But maybe if you all want to contribute to this question, and then we sort of slowly wrap up with concluding statements, or you can skip this question and we can mention any other topic that you'd still like to address.
Katja, on the gender question, I mean, I do think it's interesting that Ukraine banned only men from 18 to 60 from leaving the country. So this very archetypal supposition that men are the war fighters. This is historically true in most militaries. Even here in Australia, it was only just a few years ago that all combat roles were open to women in the Australian Army. And I think this is really problematic because it does assume, women aren't normally fighters. Women are carers of children and flee the battlefield as refugees, etc. And it's also, completely blind to the particular circumstances of individual men and women. Yeah. I mean, there are, men who are single fathers or caregivers. There are women who want to fight and don't have, parental or family responsibilities, and those kind of blanket prohibition, blanket gender classifications really reinforce the very traditional masculine approach to armed conflict. On women or others who go for humanitarian reasons, look, that's not illegal under international or national law, and indeed provision of humanitarian and medical care is specially protected under the law of war. I just wanted to address quickly one other point you raised in the previous discussion about motivation and ideology, and I do think, I'd be interested to know more about the extent to which or how many people are motivated by the failure of the international community to directly commit military forces to defend Ukraine, because there does seem to me to be an element of civil society freelancing on foreign policy, individuals stepping into the breach because we won't provide our own government's soldiers, and this idea that it is courageous and brave and principled to defend a country which is under attack and against a country, Russia, which is violating probably the most fundamental rule of the international order since 1945, and our governments are sitting by, apart from weapons and sanctions, and that's important, but they're not directly fighting as these individuals are doing.
Thank you for that. That's a really, really important point. It would be, that would be for a whole other discussion, but it is reminiscent of also in the beginning of the Syrian uprising that I think before sanctions were put in place, or I'm not sure if sanctions were already in place, but I think you were also, there was a debate going on that you were involved in where it would be illegal to join the Free Syrian Army, but unless there were sanctions in place, it would be legal to join the armed forces of the Syrian Republic under Bashar al-Assad, who's, and so I think that sparked some of this legislation as well. But I think that the sense of hypocrisy or double standards, that pervades a lot of the discussions, and that's when people take up arms or support the cause in whatever way. We have to sort of leave that there, but that is an interesting point. But I'd like to hear from Sara and Munira on the gender aspect, if we can, please.
I'm not sure if I could add anything on the gender aspect, because I think that it's kind of, as they say, on brand for Russia to not have a lot of women in their troops right now in Ukraine, and on Ukraine side they have to to rely on whatever resources they have at hand. But this is an interesting dynamic because I keep thinking about my experience living in Russia, because I'm not able to see the present circumstances for the gender dynamics. But what I can say in the future, you can expect the whole transition in the society dynamics for Ukraine, because it's the same for Russia when I was there, that because so many men had died in the previous war, that a large member of the population are women who are taking over the traditional male role in the society over there. And I think this is something that's going to translate the same for Ukraine as well, in post-war situation. So in the current conflict, I think a lot of this whole gender dynamics is largely influenced by the whole, again, as Dr. Sara said, about the whole the information warfare on the whole masculinity sense, because they want to make it up in the whole projection of strength. And I think that this is something that's going to affect them on the whole morale, in terms of demoralization as well. So this is also something to be of concern as well.
It's so interesting. You've raised it a few times, and actually you have as well, that interplay between ideological factors and geopolitical impact and vice versa. It's sort of, when we're looking to conflict in a bigger sense, and trying to assess what's the battlefield of the future like, all those nuances that we're maybe only now passing sort of, cursory attention to, I think that will become more important. And it's important to sort of see what that tells us as well, because it's not just a niche interest to look at gender, because of the way it gets instrumentalized, or some of those international law questions. If there's no problem, people might think this is not an issue, but what factors will lead to it being an issue in the future? And I think that's how your research, Sara, especially your some of those insights that you brought, I think they really illustrate those questions.
Could I just add one last point on this? It's interesting to me the way in which Ukraine has very deliberately set itself up as being more gender equal than its opponent in this war by profiling those female soldiers. But it was only very, very, very recently that they allowed women into any combat roles in Ukraine. It's an extremely patriarchal society, and the militarization of masculinity as a result of the ongoing conflict in Donbass, combined with the polarization of politics, has made it an extremely hostile place for women's rights. And so I think what will be very interesting is in the consequences, or like post-conflict environment, what it will actually mean for women. And I don't have great prospects for, I'm not anticipating great prospects for gender equality, despite that portrayal of themselves as this liberal democratic state versus the authoritarian anti-gay, lesbian, etc. rights state that they're portraying Russia as.
And if I may add on to that, I know from the history of Southeast Asia as well, women have been participants in military combats, even during the pre-war or World War II, but their contributions were largely ignored or erased at some point later. And this, I think that even with the gender inclusion in the current conflict in Ukraine, there's going to be a gradual process of erasure at some point. And I think this is the tragedy of our reality in this space.
That's such an important insight. Ben, I have one question, from Ewan Grant in London. I think we've covered the implications, but he's asking specifically, he's worked in EU programs in Ukraine and the State Border Guard Service. And so he's asking, what impact do you think news of fatalities among Australian citizens will have regarding possible changes to Australian legislation, sort of hinting at what we already covered. But I think that's an interesting way to frame it in terms of Australia's interests. Do you think, and maybe this is an invitation, we have to wrap this up, unfortunately, sort of opening this up a little bit. for the other panelists to mention, sort of have a concluding thought on, will we only step in when our interests are immediately in danger? Because at the moment it's still quite comfortable, and what will that be, those thresholds? That's an interesting question, but we have 1 minute left to sort of wrap this up, so unfortunately we can't delve into all of it. I'll thank you already, and I will just brief, so you can have the floor, all of you, at the end, and I will just then just leave it. Thank you for a fantastic panel, but please, feel free to add your final words.
Thanks, Katja. Look, on that point of what are the costs to Australia, I mean, I do think, although this is framed as a question of individual liberty, of course there are consequences for Australia. I mean, consular protection, if Australians get detained or are injured, the intelligence burden and law enforcement burden of tracking what Australians might be doing if they're committing crimes, post-traumatic stress when they return to Australia and the health costs of that, or disability and health costs if there are physical injuries to Australians. So all of that does have implications for us. The final point is just to add to the gender discussion. I do think it's interesting how there are quite a few women in the Ukrainian government civilian leadership. So deputy leaders, the Ukraine prosecutor, leaders of the of human rights NGOs, some of the key kind of propaganda parliamentarians, some of the kind of key voices you see on Twitter in the debate are certainly women taking the debate forward. So I do think that's an interesting dimension as well.
Yeah, that's really important to consider there.
I would just add, with the impacts to Australians and possible changes to legislation, the way in which we would like to think that policy is made in terms of just Australian interests, but there's a lot of ideology behind our current framing of, what is a legitimate act of political violence versus what's not, and which organizations get listed on our terror watch list. So in terms of this war, I doubt that we will see this one particularly affecting Australian legislation on foreign fighters, but I also doubt we'd get a lot of Australians actually going and committing to perpetrating violence.
That's important to keep in mind. Yeah, Munira.
From what I can say is that the whole factor of information warfare on this conflict is the one that sticks out to me the most, because it's how the rest of the world perceive the conflict and how they legitimize the action on their own terms. And I think that's something to consider as well, because that's going to translate into how the government policy response is going to be to both satisfy at the international level, but also to justify how the regional people would see it as well.
Thank you so much. So much food for thought. Thank you for a fantastic panel and for fantastic questions, and to anyone who's listened in. We will do more on this topic from ASPI, and I look forward to continuing the discussion. But thank you for giving your time to Sara, Munira, and Ben.